Welcome, traveler. You've arrived at silent history, where stories are not hurried, but told in a soft rhythm meant to calm your mind and guide you toward rest. If this journey helps you find peace tonight, consider leaving a quiet like, sharing where you're listening from, and perhaps tell me the time on your clock as you drift into sleep. Together, across distance and silence, we create a shared rhythm of history and rest. Now, close your eyes, take a long, slow breath, and let us step back into the winter of 1709. A frost so deep, so relentless, that the people who lived through it would remember it forever. The first day of the great frost did not announce itself with thunder or storms. It arrived quietly, like a whisper slipping through the night. At dawn, villagers awoke to windows rimmed with delicate lacework of ice, patterns so intricate they looked as if invisible hands had etched them during sleep. The air was still, unnaturally sharp, and when breath left human lips, it lingered like smoke before fading into the pale morning light. Snow had fallen gently overnight, softening rooftops, covering fields, muffling the usual clatter of wheels and hooves. But beneath its beauty lay the first hint of something unusual. The ground was harder than memory recalled, streams edged with ice far too early in the season, and the chill in the air carried a weight that pressed deep into bone. People pulled their cloaks tighter, rubbed their hands together, and muttered prayers into the white silence. Children marveled at the frozen windows, tracing the icy shapes with tiny fingers, while elders shook their heads, remembering winters that had been harsh, but never quite like this. The rhythm of life continued, but slower, more deliberate. Horses stamped against frozen ground. Chickens hesitated at the barn door. And humans, resilient yet cautious, took their first measured steps into the frost's domain. By the second day, the frost deepened its claim. Streams that had only flirted with thin ice were now sealed entirely, their once running waters locked in silence. Buckets lowered for water scraped against frozen surfaces, and villagers learned quickly to chip, to crack, to break through ice before they could drink. The cold sharpened sounds. A door creaking seemed louder. A boot crunching on snow echoed like a drumbeat in the still air. Dogs barked less often, their breath puffing in thick clouds, and even crows flew lower, wings heavy in the dense, frozen atmosphere. Inside cottages, the hearth became the heart of survival. Families gathered closer to fires, their bodies forming circles of warmth. Thin broth bubbled slowly in iron pots, every sip savored as though it contained not only food, but also courage. The smell of burning pine mixed with damp wool drying near flames, creating an aroma both comforting and haunting. And yet, beneath the shelter of homes, unease grew. Elders whispered that such a frost so early could not pass quickly. Eyes turned toward the horizon, searching for clouds that might bring relief. But the sky remained clear, sharp, unbroken, painted in the pale blue of merciless cold. On the third day, silence became its own presence. Snow blanketed fields and forests, muffling every sound. Travelers moving across frozen ground seemed like shadows, their footsteps swallowed by snow. The usual hum of village life, the calls of merchants, the cries of children, the creak of carts, faded into whispers. Even animals seemed subdued, cows huddled together, steam rising gently from their bodies. Goats pressed against wooden walls. Birds vanished into hedges or barns, their songs replaced by occasional soft calls, muted by the frost. The world slowed. Every action took longer. Chopping wood required measured care, each strike echoing in the still air. Carrying water demanded patience, the surface freezing almost as soon as it was poured. Meals stretched further, bread cut thinner, soups watered down to last the days ahead. And yet, amid this silence, a strange beauty unfolded. The moonlight on snow lit the night as if stars had descended to earth. Villagers paused at windows, their worries briefly softened by the silver glow, marveling at a world transformed into shimmering stillness. By the fourth day, the frost revealed its power, not only in beauty, but in hardship. Wells froze deeper. Food supplies, once taken for granted, were now handled with cautious hands. Families discovered potatoes in cellars hardened into lumps of ice, roots cracking under frost. Grain clumped in barrels, and flour resisted movement, stiffened by cold. Small fires were kept alive constantly, never allowed to die out, for relighting flames in such weather was a dangerous gamble. Children were sent to watch embers, a solemn responsibility that made them feel older than their years. The wind sharpened. It rattled shutters, pressed cold fingers through cracks in doors, and carried with it faint howls of wolves drawn closer to human dwellings. Their cries echoed across valleys, reminders that survival was shared among all living beings. And still, humans endured. With careful planning, with deliberate patience, with the warmth of community gathered in close spaces, they pressed forward. The frost was not yet at its fiercest, but already it tested resolve. The fifth day brought not just endurance, but adaptation. Neighbors gathered together, pooling wood, sharing warmth. A single large hearth in one cottage became the heart of many families, its glow shared across faces lined with both fatigue and determination. The smell of communal meals, thin soups stretched with whatever herbs or roots remained, wafted through the air, carrying both nourishment and reassurance. The act of eating together, of passing bowls from hand to hand, reminded all that survival was never solitary. Children, wrapped in layered wool, whispered stories beneath blankets, their voices soft as snow. Adults spoke less, their conversations measured, focused on planning, rationing, watching the skies for signs of change. Yet even in this hush, laughter would occasionally break through, a small spark of warmth brighter than any flame. The frost pressed hard outside, but inside, firelight wove human hearts together into something unyielding. By the sixth day, the wind learned a new language, and every word had an edge. It moved down the lanes with purpose, testing shutters, prying at doors, slipping beneath thresholds to curl cold around ankles. Smoke wandered sideways from chimneys, pulled flat by the gusts. People spoke less. They listened, to the rafters ticking, to the long moan of the flue, to fences complaining under ice. Out in the fields, drifts took on the shape of dunes, smooth-backed, treacherous. Paths vanished and had to be remade with each passage, a slow choreography of stamping, scraping, resting, stamping again. The sky was clean and hard as glass. When the sun appeared, it gave light but not heat, a distant, indifferent coin. Inside, the day's rhythm narrowed. Bank the fire, thaw a little water, stretch the loaf, check the animals, rest. Children learned the patience of tending embers, turning a blackened log until it woke with a red eye, and then a whisper of flame. The smell of resin and the faint sour of damp wool clung to the room, reminders that warmth was a work of hands, not a gift of weather. Night came early and decisive. With it, the wind's voice changed, lower, older, and the village gathered deeper into itself, one small circle of light at a time. On the seventh day, the first loaves came out of ovens heavy and tight, their crust split where steam had nowhere to go. Flour ground in milder seasons had stiffened in storerooms. Bakers hammered at it with mallets, the sound ringing like a smithy. People queued in quiet lines, mittens to mouths, watching breath plume and fade. When bread reached hands, it was held like a relic, warm for a moment, then cooling fast in the ungenerous air. The rivers groaned in their winter sleep. At their edges, ice flexed and sang with deep bell-like notes that traveled farther than voices. Children, held back by cautious parents, watched those white plains with a reverence that felt close to fear. A single sharp crack in the afternoon sent birds winging up from hedgerows, black ink spattered across the pale page of sky. Meals were measured and slow. A heel of bread softened over steam. A broth for everyone, thinner now, but shared. The talk around the bowls was practical, unfrightened, which she'd leaked, which well still took a pick well, which neighbor's goat needed shelter in another's barn. Necessity braided houses together. When the lamps were snuffed, the cold settled with a soft authority, and sleep came in brief, blanket-heavy drifts between the small watches of the fire. By the eighth day, the lanes had turned to corridors of white, bordered by shoulders of drift taller than a child. A sled made better sense than a cart. Harness bells were wrapped in cloth to spare the horses the sting of metal on skin, so travel moved without ornament, only the rhythmic hiss of runners and the quiet grunt of effort. Couriers bound for the next parish set out two at a time, roped together, a habit borrowed from mountain folk. They carried letters inside their coats where body heat could keep ink from stiffening. Messages were short, meaning traveled in restraint. We are well enough. Wood is low but holding. The baby's cough eases with steam. Hope learned to speak plainly. In the woods, trees bore their burdens with a groan and a glitter. Now and then, a limb surrendered, coming down with a report like far-off musket fire. The sound tunneled through the hush and died. Fox tracks stitched the margins of fields, neat as embroidery. Once, near the frozen brook, the print of a heron stood alone, delicate, improbable, like a signature on the winter's face. At dusk, the wind slept. A rare stillness fell, and in that interlude the village could hear itself. A ladle against a pot, a cow shifting to a better patch of straw, a quiet laugh in the next room, the small, saving music of ordinary things. On the ninth day, the hearth taught. It taught the child with chapped hands how to read the color of coals, how blue at the base meant air was needed, how to lay kindling crosswise for breath. It taught the elder which logs held a long heart and which flashed bright and were gone. The room's language was clicking sap, a soft sigh when frost left a boot, the low purr of water persuaded back to liquid. Water itself had become a ceremony. Snow gathered clean from the yard went in first, then a patient stir with a wooden spoon to keep the melt from scalding. Steam rose with a faint sweetness, as if some memory of cloud still clung to the crystals. Everyone learned to wait their turn at the cup. Throats thanked. Clothing, too, asked for attention. Seams restitched by lamplight, leather rubbed with tallow to keep it from thinking itself stone. A scarf made from an old shawl found new duty around an old man's wrists, and the ache in his hands eased enough for sleep. News was an ember carried house to house. The miller will grind tomorrow if the wheel will take it. The midwife has willow bark if hips are sore. 2 geese at the far farm, they're keeping them through, not selling. In hardship, inventory was kindness. By the 10th day, the frost felt less like a visitor and more like a season's ruler, stern, methodical, impartial. Yet something else had settled with it, a covenant of care, not signed, not spoken, but lived. A door left unlatched for a neighbor coming late, a portion held back for the widow 3 houses down, a lamp kept in a window, not for show, but as a promise. There is warmth here. Knock if you need it. Morning light arrived thin and pewter. The village answered with its own light, amber and handmade. Chickens were counted, hooves were picked. Someone shoveled the lane before anyone asked. By noon, a narrow sun found the bell of the chapel and turned it to a dim coin. No one rang it, but its presence steadied the eye. That evening a fiddle came out, hesitantly, respectfully. The first notes were soft as breath on glass, then truer, warmer. A tune everyone knew, pared to the bone so it could travel light. Feet did not dance, but shoulders dropped, and a roomful of lungs remembered how to exhale together. The cold listened at the eaves and found nothing to take from that. When sleep came, it came deeper. Fires were banked like guarded stars. Outside, the white country stretched without end. Inside, the map was smaller and infinitely rich, a hand to hold, a blanket shared, a log saved for the worst hour before dawn. 10 days done, 10 days learned. The winter would have its way. So, too, would those who had chosen to endure, slowly, gently, together. The 11th day carried with it a sharper cruelty. Frostbite began to etch its signature on skin. Fingers swelled, then numbed. Cheeks grew mottled with pale patches that no fire could quickly erase. Parents studied their children's faces with new vigilance, rubbing warmth back into small hands before they stiffened too far. Old remedies reemerged. Snow rubbed briskly on skin, cloths dipped in lukewarm water, ointments of rendered fat massaged into the flesh. Each gesture was a prayer disguised as care. The sound of the wind that day was hollow, less a howl than a rasp, as though it scraped the roofs, bare of warmth. Shutters trembled. Even animals shifted nervously in their stalls, stamping as if to remind themselves they were still alive. In the hush of the evening, the villagers shared remedies and warnings like holy texts. Which part of the body to guard, how to recognize the earliest tingle, when to retreat from the cold. The frost was relentless, but against it stood human memory and collective caution, each tip handed down like a weapon against the unseen foe. On the 12th day, the chapel bell remained quiet. The rope was frozen stiff where it hung, and when pulled, it groaned without voice. The absence unsettled the villagers. For years the bell had divided time, work, worship, meal, and rest. Without it, hours bled into one another, measured only by firewood burned or bowls emptied. The silence pressed against minds already weary. So elders filled it with their own rhythms. A candle lit at dawn. A hymn hummed at midday. A story told each evening when the fire was banked. These rituals, stitched together, became a fabric of order in place of the bell. Children noticed. They began to mimic their parents, humming the tune softly, waiting for the candle to gutter and be replaced. In that way, even as the cold swallowed sound outside, a new cadence was born within, quiet, human, resilient. The absence of one bell gave rise to many smaller voices, all keeping time against the frost. By the 13th day, the sun dared appear for longer, dragging shadows across the fields. They fell long and skeletal, stretched by the low angle of light. The snow caught and reflected them, turning even small figures into giants across the white. Children watched with awe as their own bodies cast strange companions that followed and mimicked their movements. But those shadows also warned. Wolves, lean with hunger, began to stalk nearer to the outskirts. Their prints laced the snow at the edge of farms, long-tailed, padded, deliberate. Farmers checked fences twice, sometimes 3 times. Goats were brought closer. Chickens moved indoors, every animal sheltered as if it were another child. When night came, the wolves howled. The sound was thin but carried far, weaving through chimneys and into dreams. Fires burned hotter that evening, and conversations hushed into whispers. Survival was no longer only against the cold, but against the creatures drawn near by it. The frost had allies. Wood became wealth on the 14th day. Families tallied their stacks with the same precision once given to coins. A log burned too quickly was like silver spent foolishly. One log saved was security carried forward. Children were sent out with small sleds to gather fallen branches, every twig and stick carried home as if it were treasure. The smell of sap clung to mittens, resin sticking to fingers. Men cut carefully, never swinging wildly, for every stroke of the axe drained strength needed for the long winter ahead. Piles of wood were no longer mere stacks. They were monuments of survival. Inside, the sound of fire was a steady comfort, the one voice unshaken by the frost. Families leaned close, learning how to read the fire's hunger, when it whispered for more, when it rumbled with fullness, when it sighed into embers. To tend fire well was a skill as vital as any trade. By evening, talk circled back to the same truth. Without wood, there was no life. And so the villagers guarded their stacks like treasure vaults, knowing each log meant another dawn. On the 15th day, embers became prayers. Families bent over hearths, coaxing glow back into flame with careful breaths. The red cores seemed alive, fragile hearts that needed tending. People spoke to them softly, as if words might persuade them to burn a little longer. The chapel, too, held fire. Candles lined the altar, their flames trembling but steady, while voices rose in quiet song. The hymn was not jubilant, but steady, persistent, like footsteps pressed into deep snow. It asked for endurance, for patience, for mercy against the relentless frost. When villagers stepped back into the night, the stars seemed sharper, the air so cold it bit at lungs. Yet each heart carried a piece of fire from within, an ember of faith, of resolve. The frost had lasted 15 days. The storm's hand was heavy, but the people's rhythm of prayer, of fire, of care, beat on by the 16th day. The river had ceased to flow. What once ran with music now lay silent, sealed under glassy layers of ice that groaned when weight pressed too near. People tested it cautiously with poles, listening for the hollow complaint beneath. Children were warned to keep away, but curiosity drew them to its banks. They marveled at fish visible beneath the frozen skin, moving sluggishly, like ghosts drifting between worlds. The sight was both wonder and sorrow, life trapped in silence, moving but unreachable. Men with patience cut holes in the surface, lowering lines into black water that steamed faintly in the air. Each catch was a triumph, not for feast, but for survival. A thin, bony fish stretched across bowls, its flavor diluted in broth so all could taste. The river no longer sang, but it spoke. Its voice was low, creaking, echoing through the valley with the sound of a world remade by frost. The 17th day smelled of ash. Chimneys carried plumes into the brittle sky, marking each home with a trail of survival. The smoke clung to hair, to clothes, to the very walls, a constant reminder of how thin the line between warmth and cold truly was. Children played with charcoal near the hearth, smudging fingers and cheeks, drawing patterns on scraps of wood. To them, even ash became a toy, a reminder that imagination survived alongside need. Adults counted their stores of firewood with deeper worry. The piles shrank too quickly. Some walked into the forests to gather what they could, returning with loads of twigs, pine cones, and small branches. These scraps burned fast, but every flame mattered. At night, villagers stared at their fires longer than usual, hypnotized by sparks leaping upward. Each spark was fragile, short-lived, yet brilliant. In those fleeting bursts, people saw themselves, small flames defying the endless winter. On the 18th day, hunger began to murmur louder. Portions grew smaller, bowls scraped clean. Children asked less often for seconds. They had learned the silence of rationing. Parents distracted them with stories, voices calm, weaving fables of spring fields, ripe apples and golden loaves, painting feasts in the mind to soften the ache in the belly. Preserves were rationed like jewels. A dried plum, divided into pieces, passed from hand to hand. A spoonful of honey shared among children, its sweetness lingering longer than the taste itself. Neighbors exchanged goods in whispers, a strip of meat for a sack of flour, a bundle of kindling for a handful of beans. Trade slowed, but grew more tender, each exchange less about wealth than about survival together. Hunger was patient, but so were the people. They walked slowly, spoke gently, and carried their weariness with quiet dignity. The 19th night brought a sound like thunder. Across the frozen fields, loud cracks split the silence as ice shifted and settled. People startled awake, listening in the dark as though the very earth groaned under winter's hand. The air carried strange sounds that night, wood snapping in forests, roofs shifting under snow, even the deep rumble of distant avalanches. Each noise reminded villagers that the frost was not still. It moved, reshaped, pressed against the world with unstoppable force. Children clung to parents, frightened by the groaning earth. Soft voices soothed them. The world is only stretching, only speaking. They were told to imagine giants walking across the land, their heavy footsteps shaking the ground. The story comforted them, turned fear into myth. By dawn, calm returned, but the memory of that night remained. The frost was not silent. It had a voice, and sometimes it roared. By the 20th day, the sun appeared briefly, pale and watery. Its light touched the snow but gave no warmth. Still, people turned their faces toward it, eyes closed, breathing as though light alone might nourish them. The day was filled with small labors, mending boots, patching cloaks, carrying hay to the animals. Each act performed slowly, steadily, with no wasted motion. Even fatigue had become measured, absorbed into the rhythm of deliberate living. That evening the sky cleared. Stars appeared in countless numbers, sharp as shards of ice. The Milky Way arched overhead like frost across the heavens. Families stepped out briefly, wrapped in blankets, to look upward. For a moment, the vastness made their hardships seem small, their patience vast. Inside, firelight resumed its soft dominion. And as the 20th day ended, villagers knew the frost was no passing guest. It was their world now, and they would walk within its silence for as long as it chose to stay. By the 21st day, the sky itself seemed forged of iron. Its gray weight pressed low, dull and unyielding. Light came without warmth, a pale reflection that painted everything in muted tones. The frost ruled without interruption. Work slowed further. Men chopped wood in fewer strokes, resting between each. Women stirred pots in silence, measuring every grain. The village carried itself as though time had thickened. Each hour stretched longer, heavier. That night the air carried no sound at all. Even the wolves were silent. The silence was so complete it seemed the earth had stopped breathing. And in that stillness, people felt their own breath more deeply, each exhale a visible thread of life against the frozen dark. On the 22nd day, wolves drew nearer. Their shadows flitted along the tree line, eyes gleaming faintly in the dusk. Chickens huddled in corners, dogs barked nervously, goats pressed close to fences. The villagers kept fires burning brighter at night, not only for warmth, but for warning. Stories of wolves were told again, some true, some exaggerated. Parents reminded children not to wander. Hunters walked the perimeter in pairs, carrying torches. Each howl carried across the snow like a blade, sharp and thin. But in the morning, no attack came. The wolves lingered as specters, their presence heavy, but unrealized. The frost had taught patience to all living things, even predators. By the 23rd day, the weekly market became a hushed affair. Merchants arrived with fewer goods, wagons laden with little more than hope. Stalls stood skeletal, their cloth coverings stiff with frost. Buyers moved slowly, cloaks pulled tight, hands buried deep. What could be traded was meager: a sack of beans, a few onions hardened by cold, a length of cloth. Silver mattered less now than firewood, wool, or grain. Barter became the common tongue: boots for bread, wool for salt, labor for shelter. The market square, once a place of noise and laughter, now held only whispers and the sound of snow crunching underfoot. Yet still, people came. Even the smallest trade was a reminder that life went on, that connection still breathed between them. On the 24th day, storytelling became survival. Children pressed close to hearths while grandparents, with voices low and steady, wove tales of summers past, of warm rains, of fields gold with harvest. Each word was a flame in the mind, a promise that warmth had not vanished forever. Some stories spoke of the frost itself, giving it shape and will. One tale told of a white queen who walked the land, her breath turning rivers solid. Another spoke of spirits of the dead, wandering in the cold, searching for the warmth of living homes. These stories were not told to frighten, but to explain, to make sense of the hardship pressing upon them. The children listened, wide-eyed, comforted not by answers, but by the rhythm of familiar voices. In the flicker of firelight, imagination softened the edges of reality. By the 25th day, the sun's path had shortened so much that shadows seemed to stretch endlessly. A man walking across a field carried beside him a shadow twice his height, moving slowly across the glittering snow. The light was weak, but it carried beauty. Snow crystals caught it, scattering rainbows in miniature. For a few hours each day, the frost sparkled not as an enemy, but as a jewel-studded crown upon the land. People paused in their tasks to watch the light, to let it soften the weight of cold for a little while. At night, the long shadows returned, this time darker, stretched by moonlight. Villagers watched them dance along walls and floors, silent companions in the silence of the frost. The 26th day pressed hunger sharper. Bread loaves grew thinner, stews more watery. Children chewed slowly, savoring each bite as though prolonging its existence. Adults gave up portions quietly, feigning fullness so the young could eat more. Hunger made people quieter. Words became sparse, reserved for necessity. Movement grew slower, deliberate, but hunger also made sharing more sacred. A single apple divided 6 ways tasted sweeter than any feast. That night, prayers lengthened. Voices asked not for abundance, but for endurance, for the strength to last one more day, then another. The frost had become less an enemy to defeat, and more a storm to outlast. On the 27th day, a knock came at a cottage door. A traveler, face pale with frost, stood shivering, hands raw, eyes hollow with fatigue. Without question, the door opened. A seat was offered, a bowl extended, a blanket wrapped around his shoulders. Hospitality was no luxury, it was law. To turn someone away in such weather was unthinkable. What was shared diminished the household's stores, yet it increased their spirit. The traveler, revived, told stories of other villages, of frost-gripping valleys and towns alike, of hardships mirrored everywhere. When he left the next morning, he carried with him not only warmth, but memory, the knowledge that kindness still burned amid the endless winter. The 28th day painted windows with frost. Intricate patterns, delicate as lace, crept across glass panes overnight. In the morning, children traced them with fingers, marveling at shapes like ferns, feathers, and stars. The adults saw omens in them, some good, some ill. A frost pattern shaped like a tree was said to mean spring would come early. One shaped like a bird promised safe journeys. Others, sharp and jagged, were taken as warnings. Though the cold bit deeper, these fragile artworks offered beauty. For a moment each morning, fear was replaced by wonder. The frost, though harsh, still carried artistry in its breath. On the 29th day, the moon rose round and white, a great disk of ice hanging in the sky. It cast silver light across the snow, turning fields into seas of glass. Wolves howled in chorus, their cries echoing like hymns to the frozen moon. Children peeked from windows, half frightened, half delighted. Elders muttered prayers. The moon's cold gaze felt eternal, unblinking, a reminder of how small human fires were in the face of winter's dominion. Yet beneath that pale moon, songs were sung. Fiddles played softly, voices rose gently, and for a little while humanity's warmth answered the moon's chill. By the 30th day, the frost was no longer seen as a temporary storm, but as a companion, stern, unyielding, yet constant. Survival had become a rhythm, each day a repetition of small acts. Tend the fire, share the bread, protect the weak. Villagers no longer asked, "When will this end?" Instead, they asked, "What must we do today?" Endurance replaced expectation. Hope was not in distant spring, but in each morning's fire, in each night's shelter, in the small kindnesses repeated endlessly. And so the frost held, and so did the people. 30 days had passed. The covenant of endurance remained unbroken. By the 31st day of the great frost, even the heart of every household, the cellar, felt the invasion of cold. The cellars had always been the secret guardians of life, dark spaces where root vegetables, barrels of grain, and jars of preserves were kept safe from weather and time. But now their stone walls exhaled icy breath. Moisture froze against the ceiling, creating tiny stalactites that dripped only when a flame or lantern warmed the air briefly. Potatoes split with cracks, their insides turned brittle. Carrots, once strong, now carried the glassy crunch of ice when bitten. Barrels of wheat hardened into clumps that had to be chipped away with knives. Each descent into the cellar became a ritual of patience. Mothers wrapped in cloaks and carrying candles moved deliberately, exhaling visible mist as they inspected stores. Fathers lifted barrels with care, rotating them slowly so frost would not settle too deeply on one side. Even children were allowed to help, their small hands stacking jars or carrying straw to cover crates. Villagers became archivists of survival. They marked which foods could last one more week, which must be used immediately, and which were beyond saving. The smell of earth and frost mingled with faint sense of rot, a reminder that even the strongest harvest could wither under the frost's hand. Still, the cellar remained a sanctuary of sorts, its silence filled with resolve. Every cracked root and frozen grain was met not with despair, but with determination. As long as something remained to be rationed, life would endure. By the 32nd day, communication between villages had slowed nearly to nothing. The great frost had turned paths into mazes of snow, and couriers, once the lifeblood of trade and news, were trapped by storms. Letters stacked in inns, their ink smudged by damp, their paper stiff with cold. Some messages never arrived at all, lost in the snowdrifts like whispers swallowed by silence. Still, people wrote. Families hunched by the hearth, dipping quills into ink, thinned with melted snow. Words were scratched slowly, deliberately, as though each line was a rope thrown across the frozen distance. Messages carried reassurances. We are alive. We endure. We pray you are safe. Others confessed shortages, requests for aid, or news of illness. The act of writing was an act of hope. Children learned the art of patience through this ritual. They watched their elders seal letters with wax warmed carefully against the fire. They listened to the soft crackle of parchment as folded notes were tied with twine. For them, the waiting was a lesson. News no longer traveled in days, but in fortnights or months. When, at last, a courier arrived, face raw with windburn, horse trembling from cold, the arrival of a single letter could fill an entire household with joy. The frost had made words heavy, but it had also made them precious. Each one carried the weight of survival, connection, and memory. On the 33rd day, the children of the village had begun to adapt their lives to the frost in ways adults marveled at. Their games were smaller, quieter, but no less inventive. With paths blocked and fields buried, they turned blankets into mountains, benches into castles, and firelight into the glow of imagined worlds. One child stacked sticks into a circle and declared it a frost fort. Another used pieces of wool to craft tiny figures, staging battles or dances across tabletops. Even in hardship, laughter rang out, muffled by blankets but sharp against the stillness. Their joy was quieter, but it was no less real. Education continued, reshaped by necessity. Mothers and fathers created makeshift classrooms near hearths, tracing letters in ash on wooden boards or whispering sums while stirring porridge. Children learned slowly, their lessons punctuated by the rhythm of firewood crackling and the hiss of snow melting in pots. Mistakes were met with patience, for no one had energy for scolding. Each correct answer, each written word, became a celebration, a small flame of knowledge kept alive against the dark. But children also carried responsibility. They fetched water in tiny buckets, swept snow from thresholds, or carried kindling one stick at a time. Their efforts, though small, mattered greatly. A child's pair of mittens placed over a goat's ears, a blanket adjusted over a sibling, a smile shared with a weary parent. Each gesture carried the same weight as any adult's labor. The frost had changed them, shaped them into quiet guardians of warmth and laughter. In their resilience, the village found its future. By the 34th day, clothing had become as vital as food. Wool stiffened in the cold, leather boots cracked when damp snow froze against them, and mittens wore through at the fingertips. Every seam mattered. Mothers became tailors, fathers cobblers, children apprentices in the art of mending. Near the fire, garments were spread out, and the rhythm of repair began. Needles moved slowly, pricking thick fabric. Thread drawn from unraveling old cloth was reused. Every stitch was deliberate, a line of defense against the frost. The scent of singed wool hung in the air, for garments were warmed near the fire to soften them before repair. Blankets, too, were cared for like treasures. They were layered at night, folded carefully by day, shaken to release frost. Curtains were hung over doorways, old sheets nailed to walls to keep drafts away. Even the humblest rag became valuable when patched onto a sleeve or tied around a child's ankle. These acts of mending were not just practical, they were meditative. Fingers worked slowly, voices hummed lullabies, and families gathered in quiet unity. Each repaired coat, each softened scarf was a reminder of care, patience, and the will to endure. By the 35th day, the frost had taught people that even small acts of cleanliness were vital to morale. Water was scarce and precious, but villagers still melted snow carefully for washing hands, faces, and, when possible, children's hair. The scent of clean wool, of smoke mingled with thawed snow, filled the air. Blankets were shaken, garments dried by the fire, bedding rotated to prevent damp. Frostbite wounds were rubbed with warm cloths, aches soothed with oils saved from autumn. Parents inspected their children's skin and fingers, teaching them to watch for warning signs of cold. Even grooming became ritual, hair braided tightly, mittens rubbed between hands, faces rinsed with handfuls of warm water. These rituals preserved not only health, but dignity. They reminded villagers that they were still human, still capable of order and beauty, even in hardship. The frost could strip the land, but it could not strip them of care. By the 36th day, the crows had gathered in numbers unseen before. Black against the pale horizon, they circled and called, their cries echoing through the still air, like the toll of distant bells. To some villagers, the sound was an omen of hardship yet to come. To others, it was simply nature's endurance, a reminder that even in famine, creatures of the sky found a way. Children watched the crows from windows, their sharp eyes tracing every loop and dive. Elders muttered stories of how crows were messengers, ferrying whispers between the living and the lost. When one landed near the chapel roof, its feathers dusted white with frost, people crossed themselves, half in respect, half in fear. Yet in the midst of superstition, there was also practicality. Farmers studied the birds' movements carefully. Where crows descended, it often meant scraps of grain or hidden seeds lay beneath the snow. Thus, even omens were repurposed into guidance. The crows became accidental allies, their dark wings pointing toward survival. On the 37th day, the air inside cottages was heavy with the sweet, sharp scent of resin. Pine branches, brought in to burn when hardwood grew scarce, filled the air with their fragrance as they cracked and flared in the hearth. Children gathered close, watching sap bubble and hiss as flames consumed it. Sparks leapt like fireflies, casting brief dancing shadows across walls. The smoke clung to clothes, hair, and skin until the entire household carried the forest within it. But resin brought more than warmth. Its sticky residue was pressed onto cloth to mend leaks, rubbed along cracks in wood to seal out drafts, and even smeared lightly onto leather boots to protect them from wet snow. It was a humble alchemy, born of necessity. Each family became part firekeeper, part healer, part craftsman. The smell of resin became a comfort. It lingered long after the flames died down, reminding every soul that even in scarcity, the land still offered gifts, if one knew where to look. By the 38th day, sound itself seemed altered. The frost absorbed voices, dulled echoes, and stretched silence until every whisper felt sacred. But indoors, the hush was filled with music. Families reached for fiddles, flutes, or simple whistles carved from wood. Strings were tightened slowly, instruments warmed by the fire to keep them from cracking. Songs were not grand. They were lullabies, work chants, or hymns sung softly to the rhythm of crackling logs. Children clapped with mittened hands, babies bounced on knees. Elders tapped their feet, their eyes half closed, carried back to summers when music rose freely at festivals. The frost had silenced the world outside, but inside it had created a cradle for sound. One song became a favorite, a melody with no words, hummed together until voices blended. Each family carried it in their own way, and when neighbors gathered, they found themselves humming the same tune, as if the frost had written a secret hymn in their hearts. On the 39th day, smoke itself became a burden. Chimneys, clogged with ice and soot, began to fail. Smoke lingered in rooms, thick and biting, stinging eyes and throats. Families coughed quietly, fanning the air with blankets, lifting children nearer to windows for relief. Still, fires could not be abandoned. Instead, men climbed onto roofs with axes and rods, hacking away ice, their figures black silhouettes against the pale sky. Each strike sent shards tumbling down, glittering like glass before shattering on the ground. Women carried bowls of snow to melt and boil, not only for water, but to clear the air. Herbs were tossed into flames to sweeten the smoke, though supplies grew thin. The entire village carried the taste of ash on their tongues, the smell of soot in their clothes. Yet even this hardship became part of the rhythm. Fires were stoked with care, chimneys cleared as daily duty. Smoke endured as part of survival. What once was burden became ritual. On the 40th day, a procession of lanterns lit the night. The villagers gathered, cloaks wrapped tight, each carrying a small flame sheltered in glass. They walked the frozen streets in silence, their breaths visible, their steps slow and deliberate. No words were needed. The glow of dozens of lanterns became its own hymn, flickering light reflected in snowdrifts and icicles. Children held smaller lamps, their faces shining with awe. Elders walked at the front, shoulders straight, as if leading not only the living, but also the memories of those lost to the frost. The procession ended at the chapel, where lanterns were placed in a circle around the altar. Flames trembled together, casting golden warmth into the cold air. Prayers were whispered, not asking for spring, but for strength to endure until it came. When the villagers returned to their homes, each carried back not only their lantern, but the memory of light multiplied. The frost had lasted 40 days, yet still the village burned, By the 41st morning, the market square no longer sounded like commerce. It breathed, slow even, like a sleeping giant beneath white quilts. Canvas awnings, dusted with crystal powder, sagged into soft scallops. Ropes creaked with a tired music, and stall tables wore thick mats of straw as if the season itself had tucked them in. People did not bustle. They drifted. Footsteps pressed careful ovals into the packed snow, each print darkening for a second with melt, before tightening back to frost. Mittens lifted tent flaps with a hush. Scarves stayed high. Greetings happened with glances first, eyebrows raised, shoulders tipped, the smallest nods. Only then with words, always near to the mouth, so breath could do double duty as warmth. The merchants had become winter keepers as much as sellers. A baker stacked his loaves upright like books, spines turned inward to keep the crumb from the bite of wind. A woman with dried apples shook them in a cloth so their thin faces would not fuse together with rime. The spice man, his inventory now mostly memory, set 3 nutmegs and 2 cinnamon quills on a folded square of linen and let their dark fragrance thread through the smoke in small, reassuring ribbons. Straw rustled, paper crackled, the wind edited everything else away. What changed the most was tempo. Transactions that once took moments stretched into ceremonies. A boy counted pulses with his mittened thumb, while his mother measured beans into a cup that had lost its handle. 2 neighbors exchanged half a sack of coarse flour for a narrow armload of alder sticks, palms pressed together around the trade the way people hold a candle in wind. Even coins sounded different. Cold metal chimed with a thinner, glassier ring before falling into cloth like a swallowed bell. In the middle of the square, a brazier smoldered. It did not so much heat as gather spirits around it. Someone had threaded chestnuts into a wire spiral and turned them 1/4, then again and again and again, until the skins cracked and the sweetest whiff rose, caramel, wood, and winter. Children clustered in a shoal, hands closed into shells inside their sleeves, eyes bright as river ice when sun strikes it. A chestnut passed hand to hand like a warm thought. Brief contact, brief joy, nothing wasted. There were absences, too. The fishmonger's table stood with its boards scrubbed and empty, a ship without tide. The rag seller's songs had quieted into a murmur you could only hear if you bent close. The shoe mender had posted a note, ink thick and shaky, promising to stitch by firelight and deliver by sled when the road relented. The market learned to leave space for what could not arrive. Still, marketness hung on. A girl tugged her father's sleeve and pointed up, a pennant someone had forgotten in autumn, now frozen into a translucent tongue that flicked in the wind. They both smiled the way people do when they share a secret with the day. A dog stepped delicately between boots, tail level, nose busy with the alphabet of scents the snow kept writing and erasing. A bell far off, perhaps a chapel, perhaps a sledge, ticked the hour into the white and kept everyone moving, even if slowly. When it was time to go, folks left with less than they wanted and more than nothing. Bundles rode in crooks of elbows, parcels hid under cloaks. A few small luxuries traveled carefully near the heart, where warmth could claim them. As each figure thinned into the lanes, the square exhaled and settled, straw whispering, awning sighing. The market would sleep, then breathe again tomorrow. And in kitchens, later, hands unwrapped the day. Dried apple slices made a soft, papery clatter on a plate. Beans clicked like knuckle bones into a jar. A small square of nutmeg sat near a knife as if it were a visiting prince. People noticed they had come home with something else as well, the slow assurance that others were enduring too, only a street or two away. Markets trade in more than goods. Today they had traded stamina. By dawn, the 42nd day, paper had become a kind of light. It took on the glow of whatever warmth surrounded it. Letters arrived soft-edged from the courier's inner coat. Corners curled the way sleeping leaves do. The man himself walked as if sound were heavy, laying it down carefully, the set of a heel, the scratch at a door, the gentle clearing of a throat that said, "I am here, and so are your words." Ink did not behave as it once had. In the cold, it thickened, sulked, then relented. Writers learned to sit closer to coals, to warm the quill between fingers, to let sentences come out like measured breaths. A line, a pause, a small rub of the wrist, a thought caught before it could shiver away. Children, eyes shining in the amber ring around the hearth, watched the plume's black bead touch the page and spread, a tiny eclipse that never turned to night. Receiving became ceremony. A letter was not torn but coaxed open along its crease. Wax yielded with a quiet tack, then a soft sigh. The room changed while someone read. It always did. Faces tilted into the voice, whether the words rode the air aloud or traveled silently across the reader's features. You could tell by the lips, the way they parted for a smile that was far away but present, or pressed together for a worry that arrived like a guest and took a chair by the door. What did they say? Ordinary things turned vivid by distance, wood measured and stacked, a ewe that lambed early and both were warm, a window that cracked like a river in thaw but held, a shared loaf cut in 12, the sky over the next town bleeding copper before snow, names written gently so as not to bruise them. We are well enough. We sleep close. We wait, and sometimes simply, I think of your hands. In winter, tenderness took the shape of weather. Replies were promises laid down in ink. A father's blocky script describing the way frost flowers had drawn ferns on the pantry window, the fern echoing a summer memory like a pressed plant in a book. A mother's slope-shouldered lines telling her sister that the children had learned the sound of the wind in 3 registers, door, chimney, eaves, and could mimic each one until everyone laughed. A child's careful capitals reporting that the cat had learned to sleep inside a boot, and that a chestnut was as sweet as an August plum if you closed your eyes. Couriers became constellations, points of dependable light that stitched the wide dark. They learned gullies to avoid and fences that stopped nothing but thought. They learned the faces of dogs and the pattern of drifts that moved like slow clouds across fields. At night they pressed their socks near embers, warmed their hands over their own reading, and slept with the weight of other people's sentences tucked beneath their ribs. If you looked out at evening, you might see a single lantern nodding along a lane and know a letter would live on a table before the hour turned. Rooms made space. A bowl shifted. A shawl made a nest. A candle straightened its flame, the way someone sits up when a company enters. The paper would rest there, quietly bright. Later, months later, someone would find it again, edges gone soft, folds smooth thin with rereading, and feel how ink can warm the coldest days simply by reminding a body it is remembered. On the 43rd evening, the village became constellations on earth. Candle flames gathered in windows like small suns that had agreed to come close and be domestic. The wind still sang under doors, but softer, as if it respected places made tender by ritual. Not all observance was religious, all of it was reverent. A sprig of pine above a lintel, a bowl of grain set near the threshold and later scattered for birds, a tablecloth smoothed 3 times to quiet a room. Someone tied the same ribbon around the same pewter cup their grandmother had polished by lamplight. The cup gleamed with many past nights and one present one. In chapels, breath made its own incense. Hymns walked rather than marched, and they wore wool. Voices found each other the way hands do in darkness, by listening first. Candles made halos on the ceiling beams, circles of honey light that turned wood into something older and kinder than wood. It did not matter which words people used, they all meant, keep us, keep them, keep the small flame inside the chest. Often the meal that followed was simple and felt like completion. A heel of browned bread passed, a pot of stew whose steam smelled faintly of time and long patience, a cup that went clockwise so the youngest would not have to remember rules. Gratitude had many voices, a murmur, a touch to the shoulder, a sigh that finally unspooled from a day held tight. Children were given tasks that were really invitations. Set the candles 2 hand-widths apart so the table doesn't swim in shadow. Fold the napkins with a point, like a mountain. Lift the pot with both hands and a small hope. They did these things with the solemn delight of acolytes and learned the shape of comfort. Shared, warm, slow. Outside, frost jeweled the churchyard fence, and the moon leaned its pale cheek against the bell. It looked like the world had been carved from sugar and tucked into a cool pantry to keep. But the night was not brittle. It was lit by 1,000 patient flames, and each was large enough to hold a face, a story, a wish nearly spoken. If a traveler paused on the ridge path and looked down, he would see villages scattered in the distance, like embers that refused to go out, keeping time for one another, counting the winter together. By the 44th sunrise, the forest had shed its fearsome look and put on a listening one. The storm's arguments were over. What remained were sentences written in tracks. A deer's 2-toed script curved from alder shade to thorn patch. Foxpaw ellipses stitched the white in tidy 6s. The quills of firs wrote their shadow calligraphy in long repeating strokes. People stepped into this book carefully, as if reading with their feet. Hunting days felt like studying. Breath learned to move without plume. Ears learned the grammar of far creek, near tree, snow's shallow sigh. More often than not, the prize was not a body, but a story. A place where hare had tunneled a low white room and slept. A place where finches had kept a winter picnic under a spruce. Seed shells like punctuation. A place where the creek, not yet surrendered, had braided itself into black ribbon and hummed under glass. Still, there were returns that were needed. A brace of birds, a rabbit, light and solemn, carried with respect. When such weight crossed a threshold, the kitchen recognized it. Knives were honed. Hands were washed and warmed. A moment of quiet thanked the creature by using everything. Bones for a stock that spoke in whispers while it worked. Skin crisped and saved to turn potatoes into an event. Meat divided, so each bowl knew it mattered. Foraging lived beside hunting like 2 low voices in a duet. Bark in thin curls, bitter at first, and then less so when coaxed with water, lent body to bread. Rose hips hid under a learned drift and showed their lantern red when the right palm brushed the right place. A man found a shelf mushroom iced like a cake and carried it home with the care of a sweet. Women knew where the wild thyme kept its green in the elbow of a wall, and came back with pinches that smelled of rooms that would not give up summer entirely. Children learned the alphabet of these errands. The step that does not punch through crust, the mitten tip that knows berry from bead of ice, the quiet voice that does not frighten the chickadee, so it will keep talking and tell you where the seeds are. A thaw pan set by the door, a place for frost to turn to water, to turn to steam, to turn to story. Remember the day we found the violet leaf like a handkerchief under the snow? Sometimes the only harvest was sight. A stag moved through low sunlight, his breath a priest's censer. A fox shook its coat and made a small galaxy. A crow walked instead of flew, and left notes on the white you could hum if you tried. These fed a different hunger, and that mattered too. People came home with cheeks that stung and eyes that were brighter than when they left, and put those on the table alongside the rabbit, the hips, the thyme. Supper included them all. The 45th night widened like a river and asked to be crossed slowly. Everyone knew how to do this. The room arranged itself into a listening shape, chairs drawn close, the hearth tamed to a steady glow, a kettle finding its softest voice, the world outside clapping its muffled hands against the shutters, and then deciding to wait. Stories in such weather did not need to be new. They needed to be told as if the telling were a quilt being turned and turned until the stitching showed, and the pattern felt like a road underfoot. An elder chose a beginning with the same care one chooses a path through deep snow. It was a winter with a red moon, perhaps. Or your great-grandmother could hear the river under the ice the way some folks hear a song in a shell. The children leaned forward enough to make the shadows shift into the faces of people who were gone, and yet sat down as if they had always kept that chair. The tales braided fact and kindness until neither could be teased free. A true storm softened by the way a candle was saved. A scrim of folklore pulled over a hard night so it could be carried. Names mattered. Old names polished by mouths sounded like warm coins. New names, the children's, were slipped into the weave so the story would remember where to return. The past did not feel far away. It felt like another room opened with a thumb to a latch. Between chapters, cups traveled. The drink was thin, plum water, perhaps, or a drift of apple peels made generous by heat. But it smelled like making dew, which is a fragrance better than plenty in certain seasons. Hands cradled the bowls the way hands cradle sleeping birds. Someone laughed. No one hurried the laugh away. A log collapsed and made a shifting cave of amber on the ceiling. A dog thumped twice and then dreamed in little jerks of some summer rabbit that could be caught again nightly and never die. When the story turned toward danger, as all good stories must, no one dreaded the turn. They had already learned the geography of fear this winter and knew the way out, through togetherness, attention, and small repeated acts. And so the hero mended what looked too broken to keep. The heroine listened until the locked door remembered it had hinges. And the child in the tale, who was always exactly the age of the youngest listener, remembered the map that was just a walk inside the heart. Endings did not slam, they settled. The elder's voice thinned into a ribbon and tied itself off. The fire made 3 good pops like affirmations. Someone whose hands could not be still smoothed the tablecloth, and its fibers relaxed the way shoulders do after a held breath. It felt for a minute like the night had been fed as surely as the bodies had, given a bowl, a story, a place to put its great quiet head. Before sleep, children were told one more time the lesson the frost kept teaching, that softness is a kind of strength, that slowness is a kind of wisdom, and that listening is an action as real as chopping wood. Outside, the winter pressed its cool palm to the panes and found them warm. Inside, the last light went out, and what remained was the glow that lingers after flame, the ember a story leaves in a room, and the shared knowledge that, come morning, another chapter would be waiting in the snow, written in tracks and breath for anyone who walked gently enough to read it. By the 46th day, the heavens themselves felt heavy. Clouds had retreated, leaving a vast, brittle dome overhead. The sky was so clear it seemed made of glass, an endless sheet waiting for a single crack. Stars glittered like frozen sparks, sharper than knives. The moon hung pale and hard, its light cold enough to bite. Villagers stepped outside only briefly, but each time they felt the immensity pressing down. The air was so dry it scoured throats raw. Smoke from chimneys rose straight upward, without bending, forming thin, solemn pillars that pierced the sky. Children whispered that the world had become a snow globe, and they were inside it. Adults did not disagree. The glass sky felt fragile, as though one careless shout could shatter it into shards. So they moved softly, spoke gently, and carried lanterns with the reverence of priests. Under that crystalline silence, survival felt holy. On the 47th day, attention turned to water. Wells, once reliable, had grown sluggish. Buckets lowered with a groan, returned with less than before. Ice thickened even underground, stubbornly clinging to stone walls. Families gathered at hearths, melting snow in iron pots. The hiss of flakes turning liquid became the day's most reassuring sound. Children were sent with baskets to collect clean drifts, choosing the freshest, untouched by soot or footprints. They learned to read snow like a book, where it sparkled clean, where it carried shadow, where it whispered of hidden dirt. Each flake held memory of sky, and now each became drink. Inside, water was measured carefully, a ladle dipped only once, cups shared, every drop treasured. Washing was done with rags dampened, not soaked. Steam rising from a pot felt like abundance itself. The frost had taught them that wealth was not silver or grain, but water, clear, simple, life itself. By the 48th night the full moon rose, casting its pale face across the land. Villagers called it the hunger moon, for supplies had dwindled, and the gnaw of emptiness in bellies was sharper than ever. Bread was sliced thinner, broth stretched with roots, every meal a calculation. Yet even under scarcity, people found ways to soften the night. Mothers pressed crumbs into children's palms as though they were jewels. Fathers told stories of summers when fields overflowed, their voices weaving warmth that food could not provide. Elders reminded all that hunger was not defeat, but a passage, a season to endure until plenty returned. The moon itself seemed to listen, its silver light sliding across snow like a hand smoothing a blanket. Wolves howled again at its rising, lean bodies silhouetted against ridges. But within the cottages, silence held firm, broken only by the sound of spoons scraping bowls clean. Hunger was heavy, but dignity heavier still. On the 49th day, the chapel bell, which had been stubbornly silent before, froze completely. Its metal contracted so tightly in the cold that the clapper stuck fast. When the rope was pulled, there was only a dull, lifeless thud. The absence was strange. For generations the bell had marked births, deaths, weddings, feasts, fasts. Now it marked nothing. Time felt unanchored, floating loose like smoke in the rafters. So the villagers replaced it with voices. At dawn, one elder would walk through the square, calling softly, "Rise, tend the fires." At noon, a mother would sing a hymn, her notes carrying through frozen air. At dusk, children shouted in unison, laughter stretched long enough to sound like chimes. The bell was silent, but the village was not. They became their own music, their own measure of time. And in that there was a strange freedom, no metal, no mechanism, only people keeping rhythm together. By the 50th day, the frost had become less an enemy and more a teacher. Its lessons were hard, but they had been absorbed. Patience, cooperation, silence, and endurance. People no longer asked, "When will it end?" They asked, "How shall we endure today?" Families moved with practiced grace. Fires were stoked without waste, meals prepared with ritual care, chores done as though each task carried sacred weight. The village had slowed into harmony with the frost, not resisting its grip, but learning to breathe within it. That evening, neighbors gathered in the square once more. Not for trade, nor prayer, nor ritual, but simply to stand together. Cloaks brushed against cloaks, mittens clasped briefly, lanterns swayed. No words were needed. 50 days had passed, and still they endured. The frost had tried to scatter them, to silence them, to starve them. But instead it had forged them into something stronger, an unspoken covenant of endurance. And as stars wheeled overhead, brighter than ever, the village carried that covenant in every steady breath. By the 51st dawn, the frost wore a crown. Trees glittered as if jeweled, every twig encased in crystal. The village rooftops shone like silver shields, dazzling even through the pale sun. It was beautiful, so beautiful it hurt the eyes. Yet beneath that brilliance lay the same weight. Bitter air, biting hunger, brittle silence. Children pressed their faces to windows, whispering that the world had turned to glass. Adults moved slower, wary of admiring too much, for beauty could not be eaten, nor could light fill the belly. Still, for a fleeting hour, they allowed themselves awe. Even in hardship, the frost offered splendor. Later that evening, stories told by the hearth spoke of kingdoms of ice, of spirits that walked beneath jeweled branches, of a crown made not of gold, but of winter's breath. The frost had crowned itself king, and all bowed to its reign, not in reverence, but in endurance. On the 52nd day, survival felt like a thread stretched taut. Supplies dwindled to near nothing. A single potato boiled in a pot of water became soup. A crust softened with steam became a meal. Children chewed slowly, stretching taste into memory. Mothers and fathers counted jars and sacks, with eyes like accountants of time itself. Every grain of barley measured, every spoon of flour weighed. To waste even a crumb was unthinkable. Hunger was constant, a quiet gnaw in every stomach, but what endured stronger was discipline, the will to make little last long. Neighbors began to share even more. One house lent firewood, another lent dried herbs, another lent silence, space to rest and not speak of worries. Threads woven together do not snap as easily, and so the village endured, bound by the thinnest line of care. By the 53rd day, wolves drew nearer still. Their shadows stretched across snowfields at dusk, eyes glinting like coals. Chickens clucked nervously inside pens. Dogs bristled and barked until voices hushed them, unwilling to waste strength in fear. At night the howls encircled the village. Low, mournful, they slid through chimneys and windows, curling into dreams. Children whimpered in their sleep. Parents rose to check doors twice, thrice. Torches were lit and kept burning till dawn, a circle of human fire pushing back the animal dark. Yet no wolf breached the threshold. It was as if the beasts knew those inside had little to give. Still, their presence reminded all that survival was never just against weather. It was against hunger in all its forms, within and without. The wolves would leave when the frost did. Until then, they would wait, and so would the people. On the 54th day, music returned, not in abundance, but in fragments. Children drummed spoons on bowls, mothers hummed lullabies, fathers tapped rhythms on tables. It was not performance, it was endurance given melody. Ashes in hearths glowed faintly, and around them songs grew. Old hymns were stitched with new words, silly rhymes invented on the spot, verses carried on from elders long gone. Music warmed rooms almost as much as firewood, and it cost nothing but breath. Some voices cracked, others were strong. None were perfect, and none needed to be. The sound filled spaces hunger could not. Even the animals seemed soothed, the cows shifting less, the dogs curling closer. That night, people slept with songs still in their ears, proof that spirit outlasts silence. By the 55th morning, hope itself became rationed. People spoke of spring only in whispers, cautious as though saying too much might scare it away. The horizon remained pale and merciless, yet in it shimmered something faint, a looseness in the wind, a softness in the snow's crust, a promise too small to trust, but too strong to ignore. Children asked when grass would return. Parents smiled but did not answer, for answers were dangerous. Instead, they gave tasks: sweep the hearth, fetch water, polish the kettle. Work filled the spaces where longing might grow too sharp. That evening, as the last log burned, an elder spoke. Each day we have endured is a day no frost can take back. We are not waiting for the end. We are walking through it. And with that, the village exhaled, the horizon still cold, but no longer empty. On the 56th day, the air shifted. It was subtle at first, less of a bite on the lungs, more of a dampness clinging to wool. Snow no longer crunched like shattered glass underfoot, but sagged, softened, and sighed when pressed. Icicles wept small drops that clung to their tips, trembling like diamonds reluctant to fall. Children noticed first. Their games changed, no longer cracking crusts of ice with boots, but chasing rivulets down slopes, watching how water scribbled new paths across the earth. Adults said nothing, wary of being fooled by a trick of weather, but in their silence lay cautious hope. At night, fires burned just as hot, but smoke curled differently, lazy, unhurried, almost like spring yawning in its sleep. By the 57th day, the river stirred. Beneath slabs of ice, water gurgled faintly, muffled but insistent, like a voice behind a door. Fishermen, long idle, leaned over banks to listen. Some swore they saw motion under the gray crust, a ripple, a swirl. The river had always been the village's heartbeat. Its silence through the frost was like living without a pulse. Now that faint murmur spread a warmth greater than any hearth. It said, "Not all is frozen." Beneath the stillness, life waits. Children threw pebbles onto the surface, delighted at how the ice no longer rang like iron, but thudded, softened, cracked faintly. The frost's grip was loosening, and though danger remained, the sound of water promised endurance would be rewarded. On the 58th morning, wings cut the air. not the crow nor the raven, but sparrows, tiny, brown, ordinary, miraculous. Their chirps broke the long silence like flutes piercing a dirge. People opened shutters just to listen, faces brightening despite hunger. The sparrows darted between barns, skimming snowbanks, landing on fence posts where frost still clung. They fluffed their feathers and sang as though the world had never known silence. For villagers, their return was prophecy. Life could vanish, but not forever. Songs could be buried, but not silenced. That night, children imitated sparrow calls by the fire, filling cottages with laughter. It was the first time in weeks that mirth rose unburdened, not forced. Even the elders allowed themselves to believe that spring's heralds had arrived. By the 59th day, the earth itself began to soften. Not everywhere. Fields remained bound, drifts still towered, but at edges, under eaves, near walls kissed by the low sun, patches of brown appeared. Mud clung to boots for the first time in months. It was messy, inconvenient, glorious. Farmers crouched and touched the soil with reverence, like greeting a long-lost friend. The ground was hard still, but it yielded slightly to the press of fingers. Seeds would not go in yet, but the promise of planting season stirred in every chest. That evening, hands smelled faintly of earth, and that scent lingered longer than any perfume. It was the fragrance of beginnings, of patience rewarded, of cycles turning. On the 60th day, green returned, barely, faintly, bravely. Tiny shoots of grass pushed near the base of walls where snow had retreated. Moss, damp and vivid, shone on stones along the path. A single bud swelled on a branch, small enough to miss, powerful enough to change everything. Villagers gathered to see it, one by one. They touched it gently, whispered to children, "This is spring. This is survival made visible." Hunger still gnawed, supplies were still scarce, frost still lingered. But life had answered back. That night, fires were fed with the last of the wood, not in fear, but in celebration. Flames leapt higher, crackled louder, danced brighter. People sang, not just for endurance, but for return. 60 days of frost had passed, and though scars remained, so too did strength. The frost is gone, or perhaps not gone, but changed. What once pressed against the chest with weight and silence now lingers only as memory, softened, like footprints blurred by thaw. You have walked through 60 days of ice and fire, of hunger and endurance, of silence and song. Each day has passed, and still you remain. And so, in this quiet hour, let us look back, not with fear, not with sorrow, but with the gentleness that comes when trials are complete. We began in the hush of a frozen dawn, where rooftops shone with crystal crowns and every breath turned instantly to cloud. We walked through markets hushed into ceremonies where bread was treasure and chestnuts burned like brief suns. We sat by hearths where embers became prayers, where songs bloomed in ashes, where children traced stories onto fogged panes. We endured with villagers who learned to stretch soup from a single potato, who mended garments until threads remembered every hand that held them, who treated each log of wood as if it were a jewel. We listened to wolves howl at the edges of dark, to rivers murmur faintly beneath ice, to sparrows return with fluting songs. And through it all, we saw that survival is not only the keeping of body, but the keeping of spirit. For the frost tested both, and both endured. Now, as the frost recedes, what do we bring with us? Not just scars of hunger, not only stories of cold. we carry lessons stitched into the fabric of our days. We learned that fragility is strength, that to tend to a child's fingers, to warm them with breath, to guard them against frostbite, is to honor the body's delicate truth. We learned that society endures in whispers and gestures, a candle shared, a log given, a letter read aloud by firelight. We learned that endurance is slow, not a sprint against the storm, but a steady walk, one step, then another, until dawn. The frost taught us patience. It taught us silence. It taught us that warmth is more than fire. It is presence. It is song. It is memory. And now the frost has given way. The river speaks again. The earth softens. Buds swell. Green returns. But let us linger one last time in the hush it left behind. Close your eyes if you wish. Imagine the hush of snow still around you. The air crisp but gentle now. The world slowed as it did for 60 days, until every sound, every breath, every heartbeat seemed magnified. You are safe here. You are warm. The frost can no longer harm you. It can only remind you of resilience, of connection, of quiet strength. Tonight you need not fight the frost. You need not ration wood, or count grain, or hush hunger with patience. Tonight all is provided. Warmth surrounds you, quiet holds you, time bends gently. You are free to rest. Imagine lying down beside a steady fire. The flames whisper, but not urgently. They say, sleep, sleep, sleep. Outside, snow falls, but softly now, as if the world itself is laying a blanket over you. The storm has passed. Only the lullaby remains. Each inhale is warmth drawn in. Each exhale is cold released. Inhale, peace. Exhale, burden. Slowly, gently, over and over, until body and mind grow heavy, calm, and still. What was the frost in the end? An enemy? A teacher? A mirror? Perhaps all three. It stripped life to essentials so that we could see them clearly. Fire, food, song, care, togetherness. It showed us what breaks and what bends and what endures. And then, like all seasons, it passed. So we do not curse it. We do not welcome it. We simply remember it, because in remembering, we honor the endurance that carried us through. Now, as this story closes, let its rhythm carry you down, down, down into rest. Feel the weight of blankets like snow, but warm, comforting, kind. Hear the crackle of the last ember, soft and steady. See the sparrows return in your dreams, their wings stitching spring into the sky. You have walked the long road of frost. You have reached the thaw. You have endured. Now you may rest. Good night, traveler. Good night, listener. Good night, frost. Sleep well.